So I'm now moving on to talk about information bias, the second of our major bias categories in epidemiology. So information bias goes under a couple of other names, observation bias and misclassification bias, but they largely mean the same thing. And really, you can be thought of as just a systematic misclassification of either exposure or disease status. So one way of thinking about it is that it's in terms of a 2x2 table in the simplest sort of exposure disease situation, which we've already talked about many times. And you can think about basically the way information bias operates is that it classifies people into the wrong cell. So and if this happens, and we think of information bias as happening in a kind of somewhat systematic way, but it can be either differential or non-differential. I'm going to explain what I mean by differential and non-differential. And depending on which way it is, which of those it is, then it can affect the resulting the bias of the relative risk estimate. And it can, just like selection bias, it can cause it to go up or down, or obscure a true measure, or create a false one. Let me just mention in passing some terminology. When we have continuous variables, we're more likely to use the term measurement error when we talk about misclassified continuous variables on a continuous scale. But when we talk about categorical variables, and we often use categorical variables in epidemiology, diseased, not diseased, exposed, not exposed, so or maybe various categories of exposure. When we have misclassification there, we usually refer to it just as misclassification as opposed to measurement error. So I'll start by talking about non-differential misclassification. And basically these are inaccurate. It can be either one of two things. It can be disease status, which is misclassified independently of exposure status. In other words, in the exposed and unexposed groups, it occurs more or less equally. Or alternatively, it can be the other way around. It can be exposure being misclassified in the say the case group and the control group, but not differently. In other words, it's independent of whether people have the disease or not. Exposure is misclassified in both groups. So the overall effect of either type of misclassification, non-differential misclassification, is basically to make the compared groups more similar than they would otherwise be if you had completely accurate classification. And so this kind of smears things out. In the general, in most cases, other than in very special circumstances, which you're unlikely to encounter, but for the most part, the bias is towards the null, and you're fairly safe in concluding that the bias will be towards the null if you have non-differential misclassification, either of exposure or disease. So, before I illustrate non-differential misclassification, let's just talk about the sources of, first of all, disease misclassification. So there are various ways that can occur. Doctors' misdiagnosis, a person, if you're simply asking them to report what conditions they've been diagnosed with that may be incorrect. The database may be incorrect, maybe some misrecording, miscoding, and also there are differences in the way some diseases are classified, and you may mix things up in that way. So the general implications of misclassifying disease status, non-differential by exposure status, basically you see people who should be in A being put in B and B being put in A. So there's a fuzzing up among the exposed group, and there's a similar sort of mixing up in the unexposed group. So the bias, if the true relative risk is say 3, then after this misclassification takes place, it may reduce to say 2. or if the true relative risk is 0.5, the misclassification might make it, for example, become 0.8, but always towards the null. So, not only can we misclassify disease, but we can also misclassify exposure, and this probably is a more common situation, because exposure is always misclassified to some degree, although we may have very good diagnostic methods which may ensure a fairly accurate classification of disease. That's often not the case with exposure. Various problems that can occur, imprecise measurements, measurement methods, poorly worded questionnaires, the participant may wrongly answer a question, the interviewer may be biased, and we may incorrectly record or code our data. So there are a bunch of ways in which exposure misclassification can occur. And the effect is very similar to when you had disease misclassification, but it's simply on this axis instead. So among the case group, say, exposure is being misclassified, and among the control group, exposure also being misclassified in a similar sort of way. So it's a bias towards the null, always a bias towards the null. On the other hand, we may have differential misclassification, and this is where the misclassification, say, of exposure status may be different between cases and controls, or the misclassification of disease status may be different in the exposed and the unexposed group. So, in other words, not independent of the other axis. And the direction of the misclassification is not necessarily towards the null in this situation. It can be up or down. The relative risk could be raised or lowered. It just depends on how the misclassification is working. So we make some efforts to try and figure out the directionality. So it's considered to be particularly likely to occur in, or I should say, first of all, recall bias is one example of this type of information bias, and it can occur in particularly in case control studies where the participants' case and controls may be influenced by knowing their disease status. It is less likely to occur in cohort studies because, particularly when people are the members of the cohort are first interviewed, they will not know their disease diagnosis because they're selected to be free of the disease at entry. So because they don't know their status, it's unlikely to occur in cohort studies, but definitely can occur in case control studies, recall bias. So the thing is that cases may have thought more about their disease and possible causal exposures. So I want to differentiate this from selection bias, when this may influence them more to go into the study than the controls. In this situation, it may just be more likely to influence their answers. So, in other words, cases may have given a lot more thought to their disease, and they may be ready to respond in a particular way when they get interviewed. On the other hand, controls hadn't given it much thought until the interview actually took place. So, this differential recall could occur in various ways. So you could have cases potentially falsely believing that they had been exposed, or it could be that controls are less likely to remember than cases because they hadn't spent enough time thinking about it. Or it could be some combination of the two. So the likely effect is like this. So just thinking about it in terms of a standard 2x2 table. So you would, if both of those things were operating, it could be that cases were more likely, who should be classified as unexposed, might be more likely to misremember and call themselves exposed, whereas controls who really were exposed may not remember it, so they may say that they were unexposed. So the general effect of both of these arrows is to bias the odds ratio above the true value. So in other words, it would increase it. Here's just an example. So if you have the true situation here, the relative risk being 1.7. However, in actual observed study data, some of the unexposed cases declared that they had been exposed. So instead of being 30-70, it became 40-60. And when the odds ratio is calculated, it comes out to 2.7. So it's been biased upwardly from 1.7, which is the truth. So a situation where recall bias might occur is, say, if we were carrying out a case control study of a particular birth defect, which in this case is cleft palate, and our study question was whether or not infections during pregnancy could have given rise to the cleft palate. The concern that we might have is that mothers, and we might be using children without congenital defects as a control group. The concern we might have is that mothers giving birth to children with cleft palate may have spent a lot of time thinking about their pregnancy and may more thoroughly remember colds and other infections during pregnancy. So it potentially could operate in the way that I just showed you. It could be that controls cases are more likely to report infections in early pregnancy, maybe more likely than actually occurred, or it could be that the controls misremember or just don't remember what happened. So that is the risk, and the solution that's put forward for this type of potential problem, at least, is that you would use controls who are mothers of babies with other congenital defects apparent at birth. So the idea behind this is that all mothers who have given birth to babies with congenital defects will have been thinking about events in their pregnancy and may be equally likely to accurately report or to misreport, say, infections. So it may equalize the bias, and it'll cancel out on the two groups. So that's the theory, of course. The danger is that there could be some sort of common etiology. It could be that say, infections caused some of the other birth defects being used as sort of the control birth defects. So that is a danger. It's a bit like the other cancers situation, using other cancer controls in a cancer case control study. The solution is to use a wide selection of other birth defects as the controls, and this is likely to reduce the possibility that there's a common etiology, because based on the reasoning that it's unlikely that most birth defects would have a common etiology. So the question is, how common is this bias, this recall bias? And there's surprisingly few studies which have investigated it, and it may actually be less common than we suspect. Hopefully so. But anyway, to actually to occur, the respondent, the participants in our study, would need to consciously or unconsciously make some connection between the exposure and the disease. So this would be more likely to occur if there had been some sort of publicity suggesting that there was a linkage, in which case they might be more likely to report it. But also such a situation might also cause selection bias. Sort of exposed cases might be more likely to participate. So both those biases have a similar sort of effect and could operate together. One way of actually kind of examining recall bias is to see whether cases have a tendency to over-report a very wide variety of exposures. So if there's a general over-reporting tendency for just about everything, then that might be used as an argument that in fact recall bias might be influencing the results. Another thing you can do is to ask people whether they have some sort of worry, for example, about some source of exposure, And then you can actually, if you collect that information about whether people are concerned about a particular exposure, then you can take those beliefs into account in the data analysis and adjust for them. There are various ways, various things we can do to try and reduce recall bias. Careful wording of the questionnaire, and we talked about that in some detail, some of the pitfalls. Memory aids, show cards with lists of answers, pictures of products, and so on. Whatever memory prompts that can be used, but of course used equally among the study groups in the study cases and controls, say. If it's possible to get independent verification of responses, in other words, not just to rely on people's reporting of whether they've been diagnosed with various illnesses in the past, if you can actually get access to medical records or even medical prescription or workplace records, they may be able to verify some of the responses. Biomarkers might be used in some situations, but as we've talked about, they have limited applicability, particularly for exposures that occurred some time ago. So they're really only very useful for recent exposures. As we just talked about, you can use other disease controls, such as other cancer or other birth defect controls. That's a way of trying to minimize or prevent recall bias. Let me now talk about interviewer bias. And so this is a situation that can arise if an interviewer, particularly if in a face-to-face interview, if their impression of the person being interviewed influences the way they record the answers, or the way they possibly try and push people towards answering in a certain way, even though we try and train them not to. We try and train them to apply the questions to the interviewee in exactly the same way for everybody, and not to vary from the script, not to modify the questions according to the person who they're interviewing. It can be hard to prevent this totally, particularly if the study investigators are not present at the time, but good training is very important to try and minimize this. Anyway, it's, the possibility is from interviewer bias is that it will have a similar sort of effect on the odds ratios, assuming we're doing case control study, as would recall bias. So a similar pattern of misclassification potentially could occur. But again, there's not a lot of information on interviewer bias and the extent to which it actually occurs in practice. There are some things that you can do to try and minimize it. I mean, rigorous training is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And another thing is that it's very important not to have like one interviewer for cases and one for controls. So everyone should interview a mixture of cases and controls, because no matter how hard you try and eliminate all individual idiosyncrasies from interviewers, there's always the possibility something will remain. So you don't want all interviewers applying a certain way of interviewing to a case, one interviewer applying a certain way of interviewing to cases, and another one applying a certain way of interviewing to all the controls. Then you're going to build in a systematic bias automatically. So it's good to have interviewers interviewing a randomized mixture of cases and controls. So if there are idiosyncratic things about the interviewers, then at least they get mixed between the two groups. Some interviews should be observed by a supervisor, so that should be fairly random and should occur at intervals throughout the study. Of course, then there's this careful questionnaire design and wording. They're a critical thing for reducing interviewer bias. The wording needs to be designed in such a way, written in such a way as to not to embarrass either the interviewer or the interviewee. And then you can take the data and examine it for an interviewer effect. So theoretically, at least, if you have several interviewers and they're interviewing a random selection of study participants, then the responses, the range of responses they should get, should be more or less the same on average across the interviewers. So you can simply look at the distributions of responses for particular questions across interviewers and see if there's any sort of systematic difference between one interviewer and another. If there is, then you immediately have to take some sort of action to try and eradicate it, depending on what it may be. Another thing that can be done is to blind interviewers to case and control status. So this is ideal, but often not very practicable, because it's often apparent who's a case and who's a control, perhaps because the cases look sicker, or it could be that they just want to talk about their condition. So it's hard to avoid those things. So blinding of interviewers to case and control status is good if you could, but usually it's not very practicable. So you just have to train the interviewers to administer the questionnaires in a very consistent, systematic way. You can perhaps blind the interviewers to the study hypotheses so that may not give it to them in detail, at least so that they are not influenced in their recording of answers. So that at least you can do. But case and control status blinding can be very difficult, usually not possible. So what are the solutions, generally speaking, to information bias? It's a bit like selection bias. There's not much that can be done once you've collected the data in this case, and so you're stuck with it. That's why you try and design your study, set up study procedures so that it doesn't occur. You try and minimize it right from the outset, because there's nothing you can do to adjust the results to try and compensate for it. So various things, you really want to improve the accuracy of the data collection. So you may be able to make multiple measurements of exposure rather than just a sort of a single snapshot of exposure. You may be able to get exposure measures on different days, and in some instances it may be useful to measure health outcomes, such as multiple measures of blood pressure, for example. A clear and unambiguous case definition, that's obvious. You don't want other health outcomes being mixed in with your cases, because they'll have different risk factors, and that will really blur the picture if you mix up health outcomes. Use lab results when possible either for exposure, objective measures of, for example, lead and paint or something like that, or objective measures of health status. And if you can use several different sources, such as self-report and medical records, say, or multiple measurement methods, but often that's excluded for budgetary reasons. Often we don't have the resources to use multiple methods. Usually for the most part, we use one. Commonly we have one measurement method which has been selected from a range, just for purely practicable financial reasons, because we have a limited budget for our study. But if you can use multiple methods, then well and good. At least blind the interviewers and the study participants to the study hypotheses. So even though we have to get informed consent, it may be that we can, with the agreement of the IRB, we can blur the study hypotheses to some extent. And an example of that would be studies which we carry out in South Asia, India and Nepal, where we are interested in maybe women's stove use, what sort of stoves they used and for how long and so on, although we have a lot of other questions in the questionnaire. So we might not necessarily tell the women that we're interested in stove use and what sort of fuels they use. We might talk about household factors. We might say we're studying household factors in relation to a particular disease, such as tuberculosis, say. So provided that's in the best interest of the study, that's considered to be quite an acceptable thing to do, although you need to clear it with the IRB before you actually do that. Training of interviewers, I mentioned, very important. Extensive training, sometimes can take weeks, with lots of dummy interviews, and so on. And I've mentioned also careful design and testing of questionnaires. So that's really my talk on information bias, a very important bias in epidemiology, really present in just about every epidemiology study, certainly in every observational epidemiology study. So we really have to think about what we can do to minimize it in any of the studies that we carry out. So next I'll be talking about confounding as the third important form of bias which creeps into our studies.